45 minutes with you, and there's a lot to get in, Mr. Foreign Secretary. Those who want to follow the discussion can use the hashtag AC Front Page on Twitter, send your questions in there. For those here in the audience, I'll take questions from you later in the discussion. So, Mr. Foreign Secretary, let me start with a question about the refreshed integrated review. You told, and that sets, because it's a big, broad context, it allows you to set the stage. You told the House of Commons with the original review, quote, "Our overall analysis was right and our strategic ambition on track." What's changed? And can you walk us through the priorities that you've set for the UK's role in the world?
Well, look, Fred, thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me this morning or this lunchtime or this evening for those who are watching at various other places around the world. And thank you for that reminder of how much has happened. And I think when it comes to the integrated review refresh, the thing that has changed is more about pace rather than direction. So the original integrated review, which I worked on as a more junior minister within the Foreign Office, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, set certain assumptions, certain reflections, certain observations, and we stand by those. One of which was that the geopolitical center of gravity was shifting eastwards and shifting southwards, that the areas in the world where huge economic growth and also influence were happening was in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, the UK itself is a little rock parked off the coast of Europe, but we have always had, or certainly over the last few centuries at least, very much a global perspective. And so we are not either alarmed by or shocked by that gentle shift of geopolitical center of gravity, but we do have to respond to it. In the original integrated review, we said we would have to think carefully about our posture towards China, as China desires to be more active, more influential, some would say perhaps more coercive on the world stage. We highlighted the fact that Russia remained at that point a risk, and we made the point that our Euro-Atlantic long-standing friends and partners would be just as important to the UK's self-interest and national interest in the future as they have done in the past. And obviously the relationship between the UK and the US is famous, it's strong, it's close. That has been the case for well over a century. And we recognise that in the original integrated review. So fast forward a couple of years, and we have seen a closer relationship between Beijing and Moscow. We have seen Vladimir Putin initiate an unprovoked and brutal invasion of Ukraine. We have seen energy supplies being weaponized across not just the European continent, but more widely. We've seen food supplies into developing countries consciously disrupted by Russia as a point of leverage. We have seen long-standing relationships that Vladimir Putin inherited from the old USSR at various places around the world being utilized as points of leverage. All these things we envisaged in the integrated review, but the pace, the pace is fast and it's accelerating, which has meant that we're conscious that we need to strengthen our pre-existing relationships, like the one between the UK and the US, and make sure that they're not just some romantic narrative, but are really meaningful and mutually beneficial. It means that from the UK's point of view, our long-standing relationships through the Commonwealth, for example, with India, with Singapore, with Australia, with New Zealand, are again made into something really meaningful and really useful. And finally, I would make the point that we need to recognize that all the areas of risk and all the areas of defense have to be worked on simultaneously. So traditional physical defense through NATO, for example, is something where we have a long-standing relationship with our transatlantic and European friends and partners, and we've been reminded of the importance of NATO in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In cyberspace and strategic communications, in global messaging of our values and the things that matter to us, we recognize that we have to fight on that front as well to explain why democracy matters, to explain why freedom and choice are very, very important. But finally, something which has really come into sharp focus is the need to work closely in the economic sphere, and we need to defend ourselves economically as well. And we don't have the choice to pick one or other of those. We have to do them all. We have to do them now, and we have to do them in close cooperation. And isolationism in any of those fields would be counterproductive. And I'm very much here to make the case that, we've militarily, in terms of projecting our values, in terms of protecting our economic base and the people that work in our economies, the UK and the US have always been very, very close partners. I want to make sure that on this trip and on future trips, we reinforce those three areas, because I think that gives us both, and our friends and allies around the world, the best chance of weathering what are increasingly stormy times ahead.
So, Mr. Foreign Secretary, thank you for that opening. All areas have to be worked on simultaneously. The economic sphere critical. You can't just do one or the other. At the same time, resources aren't unlimited. Yeah. And so how will you measure the success of the integrated review a year from now, 5 years from now? Number one. And then number two, in the setting of priorities, what are the 1, 2, or 3, particularly as we're talking about the US-UK relationship? Yeah,
look, this is a brilliant question and goes to the heart of what I think is a real quandary in terms of international relations. Because you're saying, what are the kind of the 1, 2, 3 year deliverables? And we live in democracies and we are accountable to our people. I think that is one of our great strengths, one of the things that both our nations are very proud of. And it means that we need to demonstrate to voters what they've got from their government, and we have to be able to demonstrate things in those 1, 2, 3 year cycles. And I think some of those questions are obvious. We want to see gas prices and food prices come down. We want to see economic growth. We want to see peace in Ukraine, and we want to be able to deliver a bit more stability to those hardworking people here in the US and in the UK and more broadly. That's the kind of thing we need to deliver in the short term. But we also need to recognize that some of the things we're discussing in the integrated review are multi-decade challenges. I talk about Russia's influence operations in many parts of the world. I talk to African leaders, for example. And many African leaders, many African countries have had relationships with Russia that are many, many decades long. And I and Secretary of State Blinken and others are talking to those leaders saying, look, Russia has brutalized its neighbor. It's breached the UN Charter. It is undermining the foundations of peace in the 20th century. And you have to be critical and actively critical. But I also recognize that we are having those conversations against the backdrop of multi-decade-long relationships between those countries and Russia. And you can't magic those relationships away overnight. In my Mansion House speech, I made the point that China is a country which can credibly trace its history back at least a couple of thousand years, and its language a couple of thousand years longer than that. Chinese written characters existed before the pyramids. And if we're thinking in 1, 2, 3 year cycles, in our interaction with countries that are thinking at least in decades, often in centuries, and sometimes in millennia, then there's a real differential of pace. So we have to have deliverables for our people in the here and now, because that's what democracy demands, and rightly so. But we also need to think long term, and we need to think what's going to happen in 10, 20, 30, 50 years' time, whilst also dealing with the here and now. And again, we can't choose to do one or the other. We have to do both. And that longer term activity is sometimes a lot harder to justify, a lot harder to explain, because often it's like water on stone. You can't see the individual change in the short term. You have to look at the big arc. And that's why I think referring to the long historic arc of our bilateral relationship matters, because if I'm justifying why the US should spend time talking to the UK and why I'm spending time talking to the US, it has to be set against that backdrop of a multi-decade relationship which has been mutually beneficial pretty much throughout the whole time.
Thank you, Mr. Foreign Secretary. So let me focus on the here and now, which you referred to, and the here and now is Ukraine.
Yeah.
UK has been, to the UK's credit, way out in front on this right from the beginning and before the actual invasion. What's at stake? What strategic objectives does the British government have that informs your decision-making toward Ukraine so forcefully?
Well, I think that Ukraine is emblematic of some really big issues. Ukraine is about more than Ukraine. It is about defending the UN Charter. And we should remind ourselves what happened, something unique in human history at the end of the Second World War. Throughout most of human history, the rules have been really simple. If you are smaller and weaker, you are preyed upon by the bigger and more powerful. And that has basically been the arc of human history. So there was a massive incentive to be big and to be powerful and to be aggressive. And that led to cycles of conflict where the powerful preyed on the less powerful. At the end of the Second World War, something genuinely unique happened. The winners decided to break that cycle. So the winners from the Second World War, who were the most powerful, decided to put institutions in place that prevented that aggressive cycle. That's why we signed up to the UN Charter. That's why we said that you can't just invade your neighbor with impunity, no matter how big and powerful you are. And in relative terms, compared with the long arc of human history, that has been really successful. That compact was breached in February of last year with that Russian invasion.
2022.
2022, yeah. One of the initial signatories attacked its neighbor. And if we don't defend the principles, then we revert back to the status quo ante, where the big and powerful prey on the weak. And that is in no one's interest. It makes the world a more dangerous and more expensive place. So we better spend the time and money defending those institutions and those principles now, or the costs, both in terms of financial costs and human costs, will be much, much, much higher in the future. So that's what's at stake. That's why the UK, and I think admirably so also the US, I think take this issue so seriously. Because how we respond to Russia's attempted full-scale invasion of Ukraine will be viewed, and it will be viewed by observers all over the world, both state and non-state actors. And they will check to see our resolve. They will want to see whether the US and the UK and the other members of the United Nations that are supporting Ukraine have got the staying power, whether we've got the grit, whether we've got the determination, or whether we're going to lose interest or lose stamina kind of 18, 24 months into this endeavor. And my argument is that if we signal to the world that we have only got about 18 months worth of staying power, then we create a more dangerous environment for the future. That's why this is so very important. So there's a strong pragmatic argument, as well as the obvious moral argument. We have, throughout our nation's histories, respective histories, we have stood shoulder to shoulder with the people defending the things that we believe in. And no country is perfect, and no country ever will be, but actually the Ukrainians have been admirable in the defense, not just of themselves, but of the principles that have kept the world relatively safe over the last 70 years. And they deserve our support.
So thank you for that powerful context. There is so much more at stake in Ukraine than Ukraine, and you outlined that brilliantly. With that as context, is our response thus far commensurate? When you visited Washington in January, the UK pledged to supply Ukraine with main battle tanks. The conversation now has turned to the provision of jets. The economists and others have endorsed the provision of F-16s, longer-range missiles, to hit the targets they are being shot from. Where does the British government stand on the provision of jets and long-range missiles? But beyond that, is what we're doing sufficient for the stakes?
Well, one of the strong arguments is that Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not the only challenge we face. And that is absolutely true. The world has never been particularly predictable, and I think is less predictable now than it has been for a long time. And there is a strong argument that we shouldn't leave our respective military cupboards bare. My answer is that, if we're saving stuff up for a rainy day, this is the rainy day. And when a permanent member of the UN Security Council invades its neighbor, that is an issue so fundamental to our international security architecture that we need to respond, and we need to respond robustly. I'm going to steal a quote from a good friend of mine, another British minister, Tom Tugendhat, who was the chair of our Foreign Affairs Select Committee. And he said that the worst fight is a fair fight, is an even fight, because it drags on and there's increased amount of damage, increased amount of death. And what we need to do is we need to bring this conflict to a conclusion, and we need to bring it to a conclusion quickly. That's why the UK decided at the beginning of this year to significantly increase our response. And we have said we will constantly keep under review what Ukraine needs to be successful in its self-defense, and that it means that we will look at how they defend themselves, how they push back against that aggression, how they retake land, and we need to help them to win quickly, because that's the best, because they have to win. Otherwise, all the things that I discussed are at stake, have a big question mark over them. So our view is that Ukraine has to be successful, has to be victorious. And the most humane way of doing that is for them to be victorious quickly. And the best way of doing that is to give them the tools that they need to get the job done, and give them those tools in the here and now. That's why the UK has been very, very vocal very active in our support, and very vocal in saying that support needs to come from allies as quickly as possible. Because, as I say, we want this to end. We want this to end soon, and we want this to end with Russia withdrawing its troops and Ukraine getting its country back.
So if one agreed with absolutely every word you just said, have we provided enough for that outcome? What does a successful counteroffensive look like? And have we provided enough, again, to the F-16s, to the long-range fires, to the things that the Ukrainians are still asking for?
Well, look, we can't possibly know until we kind of look back at events afterwards. I want to put on record the admiration that I hold for the US in terms of the scale of the support that it's given to Ukraine. You were very kind to say the UK has been very active, and we have. But of course, in absolute terms, the US has been the most generous supporter, and by extension, therefore, one of the most influential defenders of the principles that are at stake. And I thank you for doing that. We have to keep looking at opportunities to enhance and speed up the support we give to Ukraine. I'm not going to speculate about exactly what nature that would be, particularly ahead of what is likely to be a counteroffensive this spring. The one thing I would say, of course, is that this isn't a film. In films, it's really, really easy. You've got 3 acts. You've got the initial invasion and the plucky defense of Kyiv by the Ukrainians. You then have the second act, where the international community kind of rallies round and supports the Ukrainians. And then in the third act, there is a counteroffensive, and everything is easy, and the credits roll, and it's a lovely ending. Of course, the real world doesn't work like that. The Ukrainians have outperformed expectation throughout this conflict, and they have been preparing themselves. They've been training their troops. They have been learning through this conflict, and they have demonstrated themselves to be very, very effective defenders of their country. But we need to recognize that there might not be a kind of, a simple, quick, decisive breakthrough. And the point that we've made in the UK is that we have to stick with them. Now, I hope and expect they'll do very, very well, because whenever I've seen the Ukrainians, as I say, they've outperformed expectations. But we have to be realistic. This is the real world. This is not a Hollywood movie. Things are complicated, things are messy, things are difficult, things will get scary. We will expect to hear escalatory words coming out of Vladimir Putin's lips. We need to be ready for that. We need to have the resolve to continue to do the right thing, notwithstanding those comments, because, as I say, if we don't, what's at stake is of immeasurable importance and will prove, as I say, to be so much more expensive, both in terms of lives and in terms of money, if we don't re-establish the importance of those principles in the here and now.
Thank you, Mr. Foreign Secretary. So let's spin forward to July and the Vilnius Summit, the NATO Summit, and then that will be followed next year in Washington, the 75th anniversary of NATO here. Some would argue that it was the perspective of NATO membership for Ukraine that was provocative. I think those members in NATO that neighbor Ukraine, the Baltics, et cetera, would say, look at us, we're safe, we're secure, Ukraine is not. Maybe Ukraine and NATO would have been a better solution earlier. We're not there, but decisions need to be made in NATO and Vilnius. What are the UK and NATO allies thinking about regarding guarantees of Ukrainian sovereignty and territory? Is there a path you could envision at Vilnius, and will NATO membership for Ukraine be discussed there and go beyond what was decided in 2008 in Bucharest?
Well, I think it's really, really important that we remind the world of our Bucharest commitments. It strikes me that there are a number of things which will be important over the coming years. Ultimately, we want to see Ukraine's territorial integrity restored and its sovereignty restored. And of course, we want to see that country rebuilt. And there will be a degree of public money that is involved in the rebuilding of Ukraine. But ultimately, I think the heavy lifting financially should be done by the private sector. And there will be opportunities for that. Of course, Russia will need to play its part in paying for the damage that it has caused. But ultimately, if we are going to make the case that Ukraine is worth investing in the future, we also need to make the case that that investment will be safe and secure. Now, some of that will be through insurance instruments, for example, but some of it will be about making the case that Ukraine is not going to be subjected to another invasion. The exact mechanism for doing so, I think, certainly is open to discussion. There has been a commitment to Ukraine's NATO membership and NATO's open door policy. The actual timing of that, I know, will be up for debate and discussion. But ultimately, we need Ukraine and potential investors in the rest of the world to understand that we value Ukraine's safety and territorial integrity very, very highly. But I wouldn't be fixated on exactly which mechanism is best to do that. As I say, definitely not closing the door to NATO membership. That would be completely wrong, and that's not where the UK is at all. And definitely looking at how we ensure that once Ukraine has got its country back, that it's never subjected to this brutality again. And that's not just in the interests of Ukraine, that's in the interests of all of us.
Thank you for that. China, I won't ask you to repeat the Mansion House speech, which was really deep and really thoughtful on all things China. I think it's more the question of whether you see a risk of disunity on China policy. Two things, really. You saw the comments of President Macron when he left China. It's clear that there are differences within Europe. It's clear there are some differences across the Atlantic. Even here in the United States, we have an argument that maybe because China is so important, we shouldn't be doing so much regarding Ukraine. Where do you stand on that in general? And then also, how do we manage the real danger of disunity going forward in China?
So I think we should recognize that if there ever was the idea of kind of over there and over here, that those days are long gone. And the traditional Euro-Atlantic security architecture and the Pacific security architecture or the focus, you can't disentangle those. They are completely interwoven. And so there is, I know, talk here and in the UK and other parts of the world that somehow, Ukraine is a distraction, and our main focus should be on China and what China's aspirations are and what China's activities are. And the point I was making in the Mansion House speech, the point we make in the integrated review refresh, is that, of course, we are right to focus on what China aspires to do, what China is currently doing, its actions, whether it be through Belt and Road, whether it be through its military build-up, whether it be how it looks across the Taiwan Strait. And we are absolutely right to focus on those. But we can't just pretend Ukraine isn't happening, and we do need to do both. And as I say, the world is watching. And Beijing is watching. Beijing will make the leadership in Beijing, the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, will make decisions based on what they observe us doing, how much resolve we have, how much commitment we have, how good we are when we make promises, how good we are at delivering on the promises that we made. And of course that will influence their thinking. And we need to make sure we think about the message we're sending there. In terms of...
Thus the message of Ukraine is crucial in our relations with China.
Absolutely. These are not different files. Yeah. Everything is connected. Everything's being observed. When it comes to the Mansion House speech, the point that I was making is, China's big, it's influential, it is powerful. It was the largest economy in the world for 20 of the last 22 centuries. And China aspires once again to being a dominant global power. So we can't pretend that is not the case. We do absolutely have to engage with China. We also need to be realistic that China does many things with that we fundamentally disagree on. Its activities in Xinjiang against the Uyghur Muslim minority, its failure to uphold the commitments it made to us. With regard to Hong Kong, its increasing assertiveness in the South China Sea, it's the tone it's taking across the Taiwan Strait. There are many things where we're uncomfortable, and we raise these issues directly, as I did very recently when I had a meeting with senior Chinese government officials, and we will continue to do. We need to make sure that we protect ourselves, our intellectual property, our key infrastructure, just as the US is seeking to do. And we also need to make sure we are strengthening our long-term friendships and alliances in the region. And those are the three pillars that I outlined in the Mansion House speech. And again, you need to do all these things. You need to engage robustly, you need to defend at home, and you need to build alliances overseas. And that will be the long-term posture from the UK's point of view. And as I said at the beginning of this, as with all these things, they are so much more effective if we do them in close coordination and cooperation with our long-standing friends in the world.
Thank you for that. So let me ask one more question on something you raised in the beginning, which is the economic sphere, and then I'd like to take one or two questions, whatever we can get to from the audience. So we at the Atlantic Council talk a lot about the non-kinetic competition, and particularly in our era of global competition, are we doing enough as a group in the economic sphere? I think the answer is no, but then the harder question is, what do you do about it? With your Prime Minister coming here, I know you've spoken a lot about that. Chancellor Jeremy Hunt rejected the idea of going toe-to-toe with the US. I think that's playing partly off the Inflation Reduction Act. What's the UK's strategy in the economic sphere, tying together with everything else that you've said?
Well, look, UK's foreign policy has always been defined by our geography. We're an island nation. We're a relatively small island nation. We've been technological innovators from the Stephenson's rocket, from the steam engine to the Tim Berners-Lee and the World Wide Web. We very much pride ourselves of being big enough to be a significant global player, small enough to be agile and innovative. But we've always had a global network now through not just the Commonwealth, but many of our friends internationally, and that's always going to be an important part of what we do. So we think globally. We always have done. We always will do. And we recognize that partnering with countries that have similar values, similar aspirations, similar expectations, wherever they are in the world, matters to us. And the point that we would make is that the US, and you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, I completely understand in a increasingly unpredictable and competitive world why the United States would want to make sure that it protects its people. Rightly so, it's absolutely the case. All I would say is make sure you do that in cooperation, collaboration, in concert with your like-minded friends around the world, whether it be the Europeans, the UK, Japanese, South Koreans, and many others. We need to make sure that we are thinking longer term, and we're thinking about the economic relationships that we want, not just this year and next year, but in the next decade and the next couple of decades, and that we are stronger together, just as that proved to be the case in decades gone past, where the conflict was kinetic, where the security was about physical security. I think the future challenges are more likely to be in the digital sphere, cyber, and in the economic sphere. So we need to make sure, and the US needs to make sure, that its self-defense in the cyber and economic realms is as networked and internationally coordinated as it has historically been in the realm of physical defense.
And this will be a growing area of emphasis for you, common cause in these areas.
Yeah, absolutely. The world is a very, very deeply integrated place. It is, if it were ever possible to defend yourself physically, and the UK has had to do that, and our status as an island has helped. We haven't had a successful physical invasion since 1066, when, of course, the coronation the roots of that coronation were William the Conqueror cementing his authority as the new monarch of then England, nearly 1,000 years ago. Nearly 1,000 years ago. And so, that golden thread historically in the UK, and we've been able to defend ourselves physically because we're an island nation. But the simple fact is that, island status, or even a large landmass like the US, does not protect you in cyberspace. You need friends and you need partners and you need to be close to them. Does not protect you when it comes to critical mineral supply chains. You need friends, you need partners, and you need to stay close to them as well. So physically, digitally, economically, making sure that we put our arms around each other. I'm a rugby player. That's like American football, but better.
Without the pads.
Yeah. I ruined the transatlantic relationship now. But look, I played in the scrum. And you got to interlock. You put your arms around each other, you bind in tight. That is how you confront the challenges of the future. And as I say, it needs to be in all three of these spheres, because as we're seeing, the proof point is Ukraine. That conflict is being waged physically, digitally, and economically. And you either protect yourself with partners in all three of those areas, or you're going to be exposed, even a country as undoubtedly as big and powerful and influential as the United States.
Speaking of the scrum, we're going to turn to questions, and out of respect for our allies across the pond, I'd like to turn to Alistair Dauber from the Times. Are you here? And this is not the New York Times. This is the Times of London. And then we'll turn to the Financial Times after this.
Thank you.
The issue of fighter jets came up there for Ukraine, and Obviously, President Zelensky's been very clear. He wants them. He thinks they'll make a difference. He wants them immediately. Poland has also said it's necessary. Is the British position that at the moment fighter jets are not necessary for the war in Ukraine, for the Ukraine's war effort?
No, so we do recognise that air defence and the ability for the Ukrainians to interdict and defend themselves from air attack is important. We don't have F-16s in our fleet. That is not a equipment type that we can donate. We were able to donate tanks beginning of the year. We donated armoured vehicles, very significant amounts of ammunition. What we've also been doing is training the next generation of fighter pilots, the next generation of amphibious warfare troops, as well as working very closely with our international partners, the Ukrainian army. So we know that we need to keep evolving our support. Those NLAW missile systems, Javelins and NLAWs, that were so instrumental in the defense of Kyiv, that was absolutely the right thing at that point. Air defense missile systems became increasingly important over time, and the next stage will see another evolution of the support. We provide that support in close cooperation and coordination with our international allies, and we will constantly keep it under review. And I know that's such a politician's answer, but the bottom line is we have got to evolve and adapt our support, just as the Ukrainians evolve and adapt their tactics to defend themselves against Russia's invasion.
Thank you for that question. Felicia Schwartz, please, Financial Times.
Thanks so much. Secretary Blinken last week signaled he was more open for the Chinese to play a role in the diplomatic process. What is your view, and do you think that China could eventually bring Russia to the table? And then secondly, you just warned about the perils of signaling that the West is not in this for the long haul, but do you think the U.S. can sustain its current support with the election coming up next year?
So I would welcome the intervention that brought this war to a just and sustainable conclusion from wherever it came. And I don't think we should be dog in the manger about this. We know that Xi enjoys a significant degree of influence with Vladimir Putin. If he can use that influence to deliver on what he has publicly stated he feels strongly about, which is sovereignty, territorial integrity, the non-use of nuclear weapons, the non-threat of use of nuclear weapons, then why would we be critical of that intervention if it is meaningful and if he actually delivers upon it? Two big ifs. But if through his intervention he can help restore the sovereignty of Ukraine and get Russian troops out of that country, then I'm not going to be critical of that. But it needs to be more than just headline-grabbing stuff. It needs to be genuine intervention. And the second part, as I say, you know, we live in democracies. It's our greatest strength, and we have democratic cycles. And the great thing about democracies is it forces a discipline on national leaders. We have to explain and justify why we take the actions that we do. We cannot just spend money as if it's our own. We recognize that that money comes from the people that vote for us and put us in place. And we have to be able to justify why that expenditure matters, why it's in their interests, particularly at times when gas prices are going up, particularly at times when food prices are going up, particularly at times when people are worried about their personal financial circumstances. And we need to make the case, and we can't be lazy, and we can't be complacent. And I know that the UK administration is none of those things. I also know the US administration is none of those things. But we've got to make the case, and we've got to make the case robustly. And we've got to explain why it's in the interest of those middle-class Americans who are worried about their tax bills, who are worried about their food bills, that spending money on this thing now will mean that we don't have to spend more money on the next thing coming along. And it is in their interest that we do these things. It's not just about the Ukrainians. It is about the Ukrainians, of course it is, but it is, you know, when I went to, you know, Jefferson City, when I went to the Midwest, you know, it matters to those people there, and we need to make that case. And it's not going to be easy, but that's our job, and I think we should rise to it.
So we have to close, but I'd be remiss not to ask a question about the king.
Go on.
So the Britain and Commonwealth have a new king. Does a monarch still play a role in Britain in the world? And if so, what is it?
So short answer, yes. And like so many things in British society, if you started with a blank sheet of paper, this is probably not necessarily the structures that you would create, but nevertheless, somehow strangely, it manages to work. Of course, His Majesty King Charles III is the King of the United Kingdom. He's also the King of 14 other countries around the world. He is the head of the Commonwealth, 32 member states of the Commonwealth in all time zones around the globe. He is passionate about protecting the natural environment, has been for many, many decades, long before it was the cool thing to talk about. He is passionate about the diversity, not just in the UK, but around the globe, and protecting that diversity. He is passionate about making sure the international system benefits not just the rich and the wealthy and the powerful, but the poorest and most underprivileged around the world. So even if we didn't have this amazing, I had the privilege of being in Westminster Abbey during the coronation, and it was deeply, deeply moving. With all the pomp and circumstances, it was ultimately a really deeply moving thing. I found myself, on the verge of tears on a number of occasions, and there was a camera pointed right at me. I didn't think blubbing was a particularly good look. But all those things that he has advocated for and will continue to be passionate about, they really matter. And so, yes, it was in a 1,000-year-old church. And yes, the ceremony dates back to the time of William the Conqueror. And yes, it was dripping with gems and ermine, but also it was remarkably relevant to the modern world in a way that I didn't expect or predict. And I think that's why the monarchy is still relevant. And I think that was proven by the fact that so many senior people, including the First Lady, came to join us at what was ultimately a kind of, I suppose, on one level, an intimate family affair, but by the same token was an event of global significance. And the fact that it can be both simultaneously, the fact that so many people from around the world came to join us in our moment of celebration, the fact that at the heart of what the King is passionate about are so many issues which will define the modern era and the future. All these things make him very, very relevant. And it was a privilege to be there and privilege to welcome so many of our friends from around the world.
Thank you for that. It was a gorgeous moment, and many of us watching our televisions also got a little bit wet-eyed. A former head of state, head of government in the United States told me, I shouldn't mention the name, that this person was envious because it's so hard wearing both hats, head of state and head of government. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we watch the UK and watch these and almost feel vicarious emotion about it. Mr. Foreign Secretary, this just was a terrific conversation. Come back often. We'd love to hear more and more from you, and welcome to the United States on this trip.
Thank you very much. Thank you.